Hello everyone, my name is Kelly Snyder and welcome to my response to loss webinar presentation, Helping Hands, Holding Space for Grief in the Classroom. This is the kind of loss I want to focus on today. Imagine that you have a student in your Victorian literature class who gets a phone call in the middle of class to tell her that her dad has passed away from pneumonia complications and other respiratory illnesses. As her teacher, you can tell she is greatly affected by it. You want to support her as best as you can while also giving her the space she needs and deserves. You are not quite sure what to do or how to handle the situation. Next, I want to describe the grief process. The grief process is generally divided into what's referenced as the 4 tasks of mourning by J. William Worden. Task 1 is accepting the reality of the loss. In this first mourning task, the grieving individual must face the reality that the loved one is gone and won't return. Some have issues with denying the death ever happened. This denial can even lead to mummification, which is when a deceased person's possessions are made ready to use for when they return, even though they won't return. Worden said that coming to an acceptance of the reality of the loss takes time, since it involves not only an intellectual acceptance, but also an emotional one. Task 2 is processing the pain of grief. In this task, the grieving individual is likely to experience some kind of pain. Society is often uncomfortable with these feelings and tends to offer unhelpful platitudes. Mourners often experience common feelings like anxiety, anger, guilt, and depression, and loneliness. And a German word that is used for the physical pain that people experience and the emotional and behavioral pain that comes with loss is Schmerz. Task 3 is adjust to a world without the deceased. The grieving individual goes through 3 kinds of adjustments: external, internal, and spiritual adjustments. This task of mourning has to be completed because without it, the mourner will not adapt to the loss. And task 4 is find a way to remember the deceased and continue on. This is the most difficult task for most people to complete. And holding on to the attachment that the grieving individual has for the deceased person hinders this task, and failure to complete this task means life stops for the mourning person. Successful completion of this task means people find ways to remember the deceased through continuing bonds instead of becoming completely unattached to the deceased person. Next, I want to address 3 myths associated with loss in children. The first myth is that children do not grieve or they are incapable of grief until certain criteria are met within their development. The second myth is that children do not need as much support as adults after a loss, whether unexpected or expected. The third myth is that children do not understand what is going on when a loved one has died. One problem with all 3 of these losses is that children are capable of a lot more than adults tend to give them credit for. Children tend to be seen as resilient humans when faced with a loss, but that does not mean that they do not need support from those around them and potentially a counseling professional. While they may not understand everything, depending on their age of course, they do understand more than adults think. So adults in their lives should take care to sit down with the child, ask questions, and try to understand where they're coming from and explain things to the best of their ability. This is who would be on the student's team. The first person is their favorite English teacher. This person would be a warm, compassionate, and consistent presence for the student, and this should be someone that the student can confide in, within reason. The second person should be a school counselor. This person would have the same roles and functions as the English teacher, but they are able to provide more resources for dealing with whatever the student is going through. They should be like Brittany Collins' counselor in the podcast episode. The third person should be a counseling professional. Should the student experience any complicated grief reactions to the loss, a counseling professional will help the student through what they are experiencing and provide additional aid and resources to process their grief. The last person on the student's team should be the child's mother. The child's mother is likely the closest person to the student who is also experiencing the same loss. While their grief will not be the same, there is an opportunity for them to process their grief together and become a more bonded family unit. Here are 3 counseling tools provided in the 5th edition of William Worden's Grief Counseling and Grief Therapy: cognitive restructuring, directed imagery, and art, writing, and general creativity. With cognitive restructuring, thoughts and emotions can be overwhelming after a death, especially for children. The self-talk can turn negative very quickly, and cognitive restructuring can help to lessen the dysphoric feelings triggered by certain irrational thoughts. With directed imagery, this is where the mourner can imagine the deceased sitting in an empty chair across the room and saying to them what they'd say if the individual was sitting in the chair. This can be helpful for being present and talking to the deceased person instead of simply talking about them. And using art in bereavement counseling is quite beneficial for children, and there are at least four advantages to this. It helps facilitate feelings, it helps identify unrealized conflicts, more awareness of what the person has lost, and it helps to identify where the person is along the mourning process. 3 of the main diversity issues with loss with children and teenagers are age, culture, and gender. As previously mentioned, children are often considered to be people who don't grieve, but that's just not true. Others think that children's support needs are drastically different from adults, and this somehow makes it less than. Sometimes adults even think that children understand less than what they actually do, and this influences how children are treated in grief situations more often than not. And different cultures handle dying, death, and grief very differently. Everyone carries different thoughts and assumptions about the world as meant to be. What's interesting, however, is that certain worldviews can serve a protective function by allowing individuals to incorporate a major tragedy into their belief system. This isn't something that's common in the U.S., so it's interesting to think that. And with gender, there's research that suggests men and women grieve differently. And Worden stated that males favor instrumental grieving, which is approaching the loss physically or cognitively, and females, on the other hand, favor intuitive grieving that approaches grief in a more affective or emotional way. So on this slide, I have some community online and reference resources for this kind of grief and grief in general. The top left are community resources local to the Montgomery, Alabama area. The top right are various online resources, and the reference resources are at the bottom. There are a couple of other resources I used for this presentation, including a class textbook and the podcast episode I chose to listen to for this project. One additional note I want to share is that I realized a lot of this previous information was meant for a counseling professional for the child who was grieving her father. However, many things were still applicable to individuals that should be, and likely are, in her social support circle. The student will need all the help she can get as she navigates this journey, and now those around her will have a little bit of background information and know where to start looking for ways to meet her where she is and her support needs.